Hello everybody, it's Kara from Wild Book Garden, and today I'm here with part 1 of my January wrap-up. So I decided to start off the year with the book I was pretty confident I would really enjoy, and that was The Maskmaker's Daughter by Holly Webb. This is the third book in the Magical Venice series, a series I have really been enjoying. This is a series of middle grade fantasy novels that are set in kind of a fantasy version of Italy, specifically around Venice, and these are all companion books. So I do think that they go chronologically, so I would recommend reading them in order of publication, but we follow a different main character in each of the books. And in this book, our main character is named Colette, and she and her mother have a dress shop where they make these beautiful embroidered gowns for the wealthy women of Venice, and her mother never really wants to talk to Colette about her father. Colette doesn't know anything about him, and then when something happens, Colette ends up learning more about her father, and she finds out that he is a very well-respected and prestigious mask maker, and she ends up going to stay with him. And she also finds out that he is a magician in addition to being a mask maker, and she starts discovering some magical things that are going on that might be more sinister than they first appear. And I really enjoyed this one. I think this is probably one of my favorites in the series. I don't know exactly how I would rank them against each other, but I really liked this. I really liked Colette as a main character, and I think one of the things that Holly Webb does really well in her books is getting you to connect to certain aspects of the story, even if you know other things are going to happen later. Like, the emotion feels so true and real that you're hoping against hope that something won't happen, even if you know it from the synopsis, or even if you can predict it from the story. Even though you know what's coming, the characters don't, and they are very believably reacting to what's happening, so that even though you know things that they don't, you're still kind of hoping along with them, if that makes sense. Like, she does those inevitable kind of story elements really well, and in a way that feels like they aren't, almost, and they're not done in a way that is frustrating. And I also really liked the magic. Like, I like the magic in all of these books in the series. Like I said, I really enjoyed the characters. Colette is a really great main character, and I also really liked some of the side characters in this one. There's one in particular who I ended up really liking, and it was kind of surprising because the way they're introduced, you kind of peg them as like a different type of character, but I ended up really liking them in the story and the way that they developed. And altogether, I just really enjoyed this. I've been really enjoying the series. Again, as with the other books, I think that Holly Webb really balances this feeling of whimsy and fun with the more darker themes going on. Like, this book deals with grief and also kind of this idea of like seeing the people you love being in danger and feeling like you can't help them out of it. So again, just really enjoyed this. I gave The Maskmaker's Daughter 4 stars. Next, I finished So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. This is a nonfiction book pretty much about what it says in the title. It's divided up into sections about different topics having to do with racism and kind of like how to go about talking about these issues, kind of explanations of different basic concepts, and I thought this was really great. One of the first people that I heard about this book from was My Name is Marines, and one of the things she said about it that I think is very true is that this book does a great job of giving you vocabulary for things. So even if it's not all new information or anything, the specific ways that Oluo describes things or frames things or gives you examples of things, it kind of gives you useful words to use when you are talking about these things. So even if you are very familiar with a lot of the topics or a lot of the material in this book, I think that you can still get something out of it. I think the writing was very clear and engaging and approachable. I think, again, this just did a really good job of kind of covering a lot of basic issues and some more specific ones as well. And something I think Oluo did really well is, like, she was very clear about, like, there's not like a one-size-fits-all rule for how to avoid, for example, cultural appropriation or things like that. So she doesn't give you like this trick that's going to answer all your questions all the time, but I think she does a good job of addressing the complexities of those issues and then also giving you some more concrete guidelines, so that she does give you kind of a starting point or some things to consider that might help you make these decisions on kind of a case-by-case basis. So I thought this was great, and I gave So You Want to Talk About Race 5 stars. Next, I finished The Admiral's Penniless Bride by Carla Kelly. I first heard about Carla Kelly from Tatiana Night Owl on Goodreads, who I've talked about before. I really enjoy her reviews, and she talks about her very highly as an author of, I guess you would call this historical romance, although I don't think it always falls into those conventions people associate with historical romance, but she does it with characters who are more ordinary. Like, she doesn't write about a lot of like the nobility, and she also tends to write about kind of some serious underlying issues in addition to the romance, which again, that is something that a lot of romance writers do, and this is the first book I've read from her, but I would definitely agree on both counts. So in this book, we're following our main characters, Sally Paul and Admiral Charles Bright, and Sally, she is completely out of money, and she's just sat down in kind of a tea house or a cafe to have a cup of tea as she tries to figure out what to do, because she doesn't really have any options really except the workhouse. and while she is sitting there, Admiral Charles Bright sees her and he starts talking to her, and it just so happens that he's looking for a wife to kind of get his sisters off his back, and he and Sally really hit it off, and so he basically makes her an offer of like, do you want to be my wife to like make my life easier, and this will help you with your financial situation as well. Like, she doesn't tell him all the details, but he kind of knows that she's in trouble, and Sally does eventually agree to this, and so the rest of the book is about their developing relationship, them kind of like renovating his house and dealing with his sisters, meeting people in the neighborhood. But Sally also has a really sad and kind of dark past. She's actually a widow, and her husband actually, I don't think you find this out right at the beginning of the story, so I'll try not to give too many details, but her husband died by suicide in connection with something with his work that he was blamed for, that he insisted he didn't do, and that led to a lot of other people dying as well. Sorry, I'm trying not to give too many spoilery details, but I do think it's good to be prepared for certain things about this book going in. So Sally has that in her past, plus the loss of her child, so she has a lot of like really sad events in her past. So as her and the Admiral are getting to know each other and of course developing this relationship, there are also things about Sally's background and these tragedies in her life that kind of end up coming back into the story, and of course she's still dealing with that trauma and that grief. And I really enjoyed this overall. I really liked the relationship between Sally and Charles. I really love that right from the beginning they're very clear about like nothing physical is going to happen in this marriage until both parties want it. That's something that I think is very easy to do even in historical settings. I think that authors can make that clear, and I really like when they do that, so I appreciated that here. I thought the dialogue and the banter between Sally and Charles was really great. I really enjoyed both of them as characters. I really liked getting to meet some of the side characters in this book as well, and related to that, I think that Carla Kelly did a really good job of showing some period attitudes in this book while not having her main characters endorse these discriminatory ideas. I think that was a good balance of like showing the history of the period while also not having her main characters, who you're supposed to like play into those awful ideas. So I really liked that. I think this book also did a good job with certain tropes that I don't normally like. I think for the most part it handled them in ways that I enjoyed or that like made sense or like didn't bother me. So that was nice. I think the balance of the heavy content and this really sweet romance developing was done really well. And lest you think I only mention these to complain about them, I also think that the few sex scenes in this book were written really well. And I feel like overall this book is kind of in an interesting position between more, I guess, more what we would consider more typical historical romance, which tends to contain like a lot more sex scenes, and like a proper kind of romance which doesn't have any. Like, this book does have a couple, but I think that the way they're done is something that is sort of midway in between those two kinds of books. So I just think that's really interesting and something to keep in mind if you are thinking of picking up this book. So I really liked a lot of things about this book, but I did end up giving it 3.75 stars instead of like a 4 stars or higher, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is the big conflict, or kind of the fight that happens between Charles and Sally. The reason for it I think makes sense, but the actual way things happened I think was like weird and out of character for them. Like the fact that one character like refused to even ask the other character or allow the other character to explain, I thought that was weird. And just like some of the reactions I think were just like very out of character, and I didn't like that. There is an apology for some of that behavior, which I appreciated, but I just think that that part of the book could have been done better and in a way that felt more true to the characters. I was really enjoying how like sensible both of these characters were, and even if they didn't always like communicate their feelings perfectly, I felt like they were good at, I don't know, communicating with each other in general. And then to have this happen felt very frustrating, and it felt like just a way to drag out the book or like add this like unnecessary drama or conflict, and I really didn't like that. And then there were a couple of things about the ending that I would have liked to be done a little differently, but overall I did really enjoy this, and I'm excited to read more from Carla Kelly. Next, I finished The Girl of Glass by Holly Webb. This is the 4th and final book in the Magical Venice series. I figured like I was enjoying the series so much, I kind of just wanted to finish it, so that's what I did. And in this book we are following our main character Mariana, and she has grown up on one of the glass-making islands. I mean, they're not called the same things, but like basically that's what it is. I think she lives on like the fantasy version of Murano, which was really cool. So you know from the back of the book that Mariana's younger sister Eliza actually dies. That's like said in the synopsis and everything, so it's not a spoiler. And then when this happens, her father, who is again a glass maker, he ends up kind of making this glass replica of her sister Eliza because he thinks it will kind of help her mother's grief about losing her. And it's clearly this very impressive feat of magic because this glass Eliza, she like talks, she walks, she has the memories of Eliza, so it's this really impressive work of magic, but it's also kind of disturbing. And Mariana begins to think that this glass Eliza could actually be like the ghost of her sister, or like connected to her sister in some way because she feels so much like her. And then a lot of other things happen in the book that involve, you know, people being fascinated by this work of magic. And Mariana and her family are kind of struggling with how much of Eliza is in this glass girl. And you also see this conflict of, is this glass Eliza her own person, or is she actually like connected to Eliza in some way? Is she somewhere in between? Like, what is going on with this? And that causes a lot of kind of interpersonal conflicts as well. And I thought this was a really interesting one. Once again, I really enjoyed the magic and the setting. I thought the characters were well developed. But this actually was my least favorite book in the series. It's the only one I gave 3.5 stars instead of 4 stars because I had some issues with it. One of the big ones was the ending and the way that certain things were resolved. Like there's a couple of like really dark things that happen at the end that I think were kind of glossed over, and that surprised me because, again, even though I've said with some of the other books that the ending kind of happens a little too fast, I feel like the dark content of the books tend to be handled in a really thoughtful way, and so I was really surprised that this one didn't do that so much. And then I also think that with the plot of this story, by the time you finish it, I feel like some of the messages or themes or ideas get kind of muddled and mixed up, and yeah, there's a couple things in particular where I'm like, this kind of contradicts, I feel like, what we're supposed to take away from the story, so I didn't love that either. So yeah, I did still like this one. I think that if you are reading and enjoying the series, it's definitely worth reading, and I'm glad I finished the series, and I did enjoy other things about it. Like I said, the magic and the characters. I think Holly Webb does a really good job of kind of subverting your expectations with some of the side characters sometimes, so that was really interesting as well. And she's also just good at creating characters where like you're trying to make up your mind about them, because there are some things about them that really bug you, and then there's some things where you can kind of see where they're coming from, and I feel like that's very true to life, and I just think that was very impressive. So yeah, I did like things about this book, but it wasn't my favorite. And like I said, I gave The Girl of Glass 3.5 stars. Next, I finished Sunny by Jason Reynolds. This is the third book in the Track companion series, which is another one that I have been really enjoying. And in this series, we follow a different character in each book, so it is a companion series, and they're all members of a track team. And each book kind of deals with one of the kids and their kind of situation, things that they're struggling with. Sometimes it's like their home life or other issues going on in their lives. And we see how they're friends from the track team and just being a part of the track team, and like how that kind of helps them through it. We see what running means to them. And I've just really been enjoying this series. In this third book, our main character is of course Sunny, and I don't have a lot to say about this one. I really enjoyed it, as with the other books in the series. I think that the topics in this one were, again, handled very well. They just were very emotional. Like, I think the emotional content of this book was done really well. Sunny and his father are both really grieving the loss of Sunny's mother, and we see how that has kind of like pushed them apart or kept them separate from each other, even though it is something that unites them, and even though they are kind of still united in their grief. Like, Sunny and his father have kind of a complicated relationship because of his mother's death, and like seeing that explored throughout the book was just very well done, very heartbreaking, but also heartwarming at points. I really love seeing the whole track team, these characters that we have come to know and love from their own books, or even some of the side characters who are not like protagonists in any books in the series, but who definitely have a presence in this book. And I also thought it was very interesting, like, I don't know if I'm just misremembering, but I feel like Sunny was kind of the quiet one in the first couple books, and here, like, his narration style is just very like energetic and just really interesting, and I really liked that. I really liked this, like, getting to see how the way he talks and thinks and sees the world is not necessarily the impression that you get from him when you like just meet him for the first time, or you're just getting to know him. So I thought that was a really interesting element, assuming I'm remembering correctly from the first couple books, and I gave Sunny 4 stars. Next, I finished Hattie Big Sky by Kirby Larson. This is a historical fiction book set mostly in Montana. We follow our main character Hattie. So Hattie lives in Arlington, Iowa, and she is an orphan, and she's kind of been like taken care of by various family members throughout her life, many of whom are not actually happy to have her, and they make that pretty clear to her. So she hasn't had a very warm upbringing, and she stayed now with her aunt and uncle for I think a few years at this point. I think this is the longest that she's stayed with any family member, and her aunt is wanting her to like get a job as a maid, I think, to kind of like start supporting the family, and like she has Hattie's future kind of all planned out for her, and this isn't what Hattie wants. And she gets a letter that one of her, I think he's like a distant uncle, and she ends up getting a letter that one of her other uncles has actually died recently, and he left his homestead to Hattie, and it's in Vida, Montana, and with it is the offer to like come to this homestead and to try and prove up on his claim, which essentially is the process where you start out with a claim or like a settlement, and you have to meet these certain criteria before you're considered like an official, I guess like house or ranch or something. And so Hattie decides kind of impulsively that she's going to do this, that she's going to move all by herself out to Montana and try and take on her late uncle's homestead claim rather than being pushed into this life by her aunt that she doesn't want. She figures if she's going to be doing all this hard work, she might as well do it for something that gives her some independence. So she moves there, and the book is about her figuring out how to survive in this very harsh climate and these harsh conditions. She has some friends and neighbors who kind of help her along the way, and a lot of this book also takes place during the Great War, and that was really interesting to see World War I from the perspective of kind of a like settlement or like pioneer story. I feel like those kinds of historical fiction don't often overlap, but obviously when World War I was happening, like everybody in the country was affected by it, including people in these more rural communities. So that was really interesting. You also see the way that xenophobia plays out with some of the German characters or German American characters. So that's one of the conflicts as well, in addition to Hattie just struggling to survive and to like figure out how to run like a homestead here when she has no real experience doing this. Like she knows a couple of things from when she stayed with some of her family members who had farms, but this is definitely a different environment and experience for her. And we also see her like struggling to meet the requirements so that she can prove up on her claim and get to keep her land. I feel like that was a very long summary, so I'm sorry about that. But I had mixed feelings about this book. I really liked Hattie as the main character. I think she was really like plucky and spunky and intelligent, and I just enjoyed her. This is set up sort of like a diary of like her life as she's trying to like figure out how to live on this homestead, and I liked some of the humor that she interjected. I enjoyed some of the side characters as well. There's one in particular who's like this older woman who she and Hattie kind of become friends, and I just really enjoyed her. She's like very no nonsense. She's kind of like one of those characters who like she's old enough to say what she thinks, and she's not worried about what people are going to say to her, and I really enjoyed that. I think she was a good role model for Hattie. Like I mentioned, I think the World War I elements were done in a very interesting way that we don't see in a lot of historical fiction, or like this perspective, kind of like this setting. Also, I did not think about the fact that because this book takes place during the Great War, it would also take place during the Spanish flu epidemic. So that was a little too close to home in some places, but I think those scenes were actually like the emotional impact of that I think was done very effectively. So I think even though that wasn't a pleasant part to read in the book, it was I think a very like effective or well done one. I thought the themes regarding prejudice were very interesting, and I also thought it was very believable how Hattie starts out the book kind of buying into these like hyper-patriotic xenophobic ideas of like German Americans and like immigrants are the enemy and they're not loyal to America and that kind of thing. And then as the book goes on, we see that as she meets these people and she befriends these people, she is kind of torn between like wanting to support the Americans and their allies who are fighting in the war, but then also like knowing people who are German or who have like married Germans and like knowing that they're not bad people. So she's like trying to reconcile these two things, and I think that that was done in a way that felt pretty believable, especially considering that Hattie is, I think she's fairly young, she's 16 years old. So I think that kind of arc of like her starting out being like kind of buying into this idea and then like starting to unpick it and like look at it more critically and then realizing like, wait, these are not actually bad people, why are we treating them like the enemy? Like I think that development was like pretty well done, but I did have some issues with this book. One of them is just kind of a personal preference thing. I guess I assumed from the premise of the book that more of the book would be focused on what happens like around the survival aspects, if that makes sense. Like I definitely expected some amount of like homestead and like survival kind of elements in this book, but I didn't expect it to be such a prominent part of the story, just again based on kind of what I thought the focus of the book was going to be. Like it talks about that, but it also talks a lot about like the character stuff, and those are the parts of the book that I found most interesting. I don't really like survival type stories, so when it was like really detailed, like how she has to prepare for the winter and like she needed to have someone to help her to do this like particular thing and she didn't know how to do this, so she almost got caught in a snowstorm kind of thing. Those were not my favorite parts, but I know other people like those kind of things more than me. And then a really big problem I had with this book was the ending. and not actually what happened in the ending. Like, I think it makes sense, but the specific ways that things were done did not make sense to me. Like, the reason that certain characters made choices, like, it's a valid reason, I understand that, but the way it was written felt very strange and very abrupt, and it didn't make sense to me, and it was one of those endings where, like, you end the book and it's like, kind of feels like the whole story didn't even matter. Like, at least that's how I felt about it, so that I found that very frustrating. And it wasn't just like one thing about the ending, there were like several things that happened in the end where I was like, why? Like why write it this way? Because again, like, the actual events, like, I think made sense, but I think they could have been written in a way that felt more believable or that felt more in character, and that also didn't leave you feeling like a lot of parts of the story didn't end up mattering in the end. Like, at least that's how I felt about it, and that did really affect my feelings on the book overall. Also, just as a side note, and maybe this registers so clearly with me because shortly before this I had been reading a lot of books by Indigenous authors, but it was kind of grating to see the repeated talk from these settlers about like how unforgiving the climate is, when it's like, well, you know who is really good at surviving these conditions? The indigenous populations that you like pushed off this land, or like killed or evicted. And like, I know that that is not unique to this location. Everywhere in the United States is stolen land, but there was just something about like coming out of reading so many books by Native authors and then reading this book, and this isn't really something that I like took off points for, because it's not that I expect the author to have these characters address that, because that wouldn't have even been something that occurred to them, and it's not set, like, I think by the time this book was set, most of the Native populations had been forced onto reservations anyway, so it's not like Little House on the Prairie situation where these characters would have been coming in contact with the Native peoples. So again, it's like, I'm not taking off points for it. I'm not saying the author like should have had these characters talk about how wrong this was. That's just something I want to note if you are planning to go into this book. It's just like kind of frustrating to read that at some points. So I feel like I was all over the place with this book. There were some parts that I think were really well done, but overall there weren't a lot of things I actively loved about it, I guess. Like, I expected to be more engaged with the plot, and I liked the character development or character interactions moments, but the actual story itself was not always my favorite. I liked Hattie, but I think, like, especially considering this was a Newbery Honor book, I think I expected to feel more connected to this story than I was. Like, I don't know if that's because I don't know if that's like the characters weren't grabbing me as much, or if this was just like a function of I don't love survival stories, and a big chunk of that was, I think, supposed to be I think a big chunk of the interest was supposed to come from like how they did things on the frontier, and that's just not something that super interests me in historical fiction. And then, like I said, like, the big problems I had with the ending, and specifically the way that those ending pieces were written and handled, I didn't like that either. So like, kind of all over the place with this one. I gave Hattie Big Sky 3 stars. I do think it's worth reading, and like I said, there were things about it that I liked and that I thought were done well. I just didn't love it like I think a lot of people do, judging by the Goodreads reviews. The next book I finished was a reread that I had actually started around Christmas, but I didn't finish it until January, and that is the Enchanted Sonata by Heather Dixon Walwork. This is now, I think, the 3rd time that I have read this around Christmas, and I still love it. This time around it was sort of an unofficial buddy read with Katie from A Sea of Tomes and Bendy from Caught Between Pages. This is a Nutcracker retelling that also has some elements of the Pied Piper. We follow our main character, Clara Stahlbaum, and she gets transported to this world of Imperia, which is sort of like a slightly Russian-inspired like fantasy setting that is also like very much inspired by the Nutcracker story. And of course there is the Nutcracker character, and he has been transformed into his like Nutcracker persona by like the antagonist of this book, and so Clara and the Nutcracker end up having to work together to try and defeat this person and reverse the spells that he has cast on some of the people of Imperia. And the whole time this is going on, Clara really wants to get back home so she can be ready for her piano concert, so she's kind of got that like conflict of like, do I want to stay or do I want to go home, which like is something I love. Like, it tends to be something that I think of with like time slip stories, but I really enjoyed it here as well. And like I said, I really love this book. I have loved it every time I read it. It's one of those where like I can point to all of these concrete things that I enjoy about it and that I think are well done, but it's still one of those books where like it's more than the sum of its parts, in that I don't know exactly why this is like an all-time favorite for me, rather than just, oh, that was really great and I really liked that. But yeah, I love Clara as the main character. I think she is just very believable and very Like she's very brave in believable ways. She is scared when it makes sense to be. She's funny and clever, and like the dialogue between her and the Nutcracker is just like so good. Like I really love the humor of this book. There's some side characters who have some really great humor as well, and just like the side characters in general I think are really well developed. I've talked before about how I think this is one of my favorite like side character romances. Like I love the main romance as well, but like I really enjoy side characters. I tend to latch onto those in stories, and I also really love a well done side character romance, which this book has, and I'm not going to tell you who it is because that's part of the fun, but I absolutely loved it. I love the magic of this book, like both the actual like how music functions as magic in this book, and also just like the magic setting, the magical feeling of it. I love the writing. I mentioned how much I love the characters. I also really love Nutcracker as kind of the other main character. I just really love this whole story, and I think a lot of it is more not always lighthearted, but I think there's like this kind of like fun adventure element to it that is kind of like most of the story. But I also think there are some places where this book touches on some like deeper ideas. Like one of the things that really strikes me about this book, and it's not a main focus of the story, but it's something that I think is really well done, is the way this book shows how sometimes people develop feelings for other people not because of who they are as a person, but because of who they represent to them or what they represent to them. Like, and this idea of who this person is or what they would mean to them or like what their life would be like with them. And again, it's not a big part of the book, but I think that was done so well. I also think this book handles grief a little bit. And again, that's not a major focus of this book. Overall, I think this book is more of a light and kind of fun adventure story, but there are those darker elements to it, and I think those were handled really well. Someday I think I'm gonna try and do a full review on this book, but again, it's just one of my favorites. I really love it. I don't think you would necessarily have to read it around Christmas time. I have been, but I think even if you don't read it around then, or if you don't celebrate Christmas, I feel like you could still enjoy this. And once again, I gave the Enchanted Sonata 5 stars. And finally, the last book I'm going to talk about today is the last book in the Track series, and that is Lou by Jason Reynolds. We are of course following our main character Lou, and he is such an interesting main character. I actually, like, spoilers, I ended up giving this book 5 stars. It was my favorite in the whole series. And I had the feeling like when we meet Lou in the first book and he's like kind of annoying, but then later on in that same book we kind of find out more about his life and his backstory. I got the feeling, I'm like, I feel like his story might be my favorite because of the character depth we're going to get from him, and I was right. Like, I really loved this. So Lou is albino, and that's kind of a big element of this story because you find out that even though he has a very loving and supportive family, he also deals with feelings of not being black enough because he doesn't necessarily look black or like what people think of like black people should look like. And so we see that even though he's got this very cocky and confident like attitude, sometimes that is covering up for how worried he is that he doesn't fit in or that he's not enough for people. And his story just was so well done. I really enjoyed his narration. I loved seeing him as part of this track team and how these friends like really support each other and they're really there for each other, and they mess around and have fun and tease each other, but they're always there for each other too, and I really loved that. I also liked getting to see the backstory of other like side characters. Like, we learn more about their coach kind of his life, and that was really interesting and very like, I was not expecting this book to go some of the places that it did, and I think that was done very effectively. I also think that the way this book would kind of reveal some of the other things that other characters were dealing with was done really well. Like, you're reading from Lou's perspective, so there were some times where you would kind of you would kind of form your judgment about another character based on how Lou perceived them and like how they interacted with Lou, and you kind of like, you know, based on the way they were treating him, you kind of decided like who this person was. And then you find out things later that like it just made them so much more complex, even though again they were like a very minor character who like we don't get a perspective from or anything. But I think the way that those like backstories and topics and like these different things involving these other characters, I think the way that you kind of gradually find those things out or realize them throughout the book was done really well. I also think the ending of this one was really interesting and really well done because it was something that I think is very hard to for an author to pull off in a way that feels convincing or satisfying, and I think Jason Reynolds really nailed it here. So yeah, I gave Lou 5 stars. I really enjoyed this whole series, and even though it's funny, like rating wise this is my favorite, but there are also things about some of the other books that could make them my favorite. So I just love the series all around, highly recommend it, and this is definitely one of my favorites in the series, if not my favorite. Okay everybody, so those are the books I read for the first part of January. Please comment down below and let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick them up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!